The echo of a laugh. My name is Michael Nollid, and I am by trade a certified public accountant, a purveyor of balance sheets and tax law, a man who finds profound comfort in the immutable logic of debits and credits. By fate, however, I am the friend and occasional assistant of Daniel Dillon, the most reluctant private investigator you will ever meet. Our office, if you can call it that, is the back booth of a diner called Mel's Griddle, a place that smells perpetually of strong coffee, frying grease, and a vague collective regret that seeps from the vinyl seats. The coffee is bitter, the eggs are always a little too greasy, and the neon sign outside flickers like a faulty heartbeat. It suits us perfectly. Mel himself, a man with a permanent grease stain on his apron and the weary eyes of a philosopher, knows our order by heart and never asks questions, which is the most valuable service any establishment can provide in our line of work. It's a place where lost things and lost people seem to gather, and for a man like Daniel, who is the most lost of us all, it's the only place that feels like home. I watched Daniel stir his black coffee, his eyes fixed on the swirling liquid, as if it held the answers to questions he'd long since stopped asking. The spoon made a slow rhythmic clink against the chipped ceramic mug, a sound so monotonous it seemed to measure out the heavy silence between us. He'd been stirring for a full minute, the coffee long past any need for it, lost in a ritual of quiet torment. The man sitting across from me was a ghost of his former self, a photograph left in the sun too long. The colors were faded, the edges curled, the vibrant image of the man he had been now just a faint, washed-out impression. The lines on his face weren't from laughter. They were fissures carved by a single seismic tragedy, a cataclysm that had reshaped the very bedrock of him and left canyons of grief in its wake. Each groove around his eyes, each furrow on his brow, told a story of sleepless nights and a pain so deep it had become a permanent resident in his features. He was here in the booth, but the essential part of him, the light that had once drawn people in, remained in the past, trapped in a memory he could neither leave nor bear to revisit. 2 years ago, Daniel wasn't a PI. He was Detective Daniel Dillon, a rising star in the Major Crimes Unit, the one they tapped for the press conferences, because he could project both unshakable authority and genuine compassion. He had a quick mind that could unravel a suspect's lie like a knot of old string, a good heart that believed in the system's capacity for justice, and a laugh that was a deep, rolling baritone that could fill a room and make you feel like you were in on the joke. He also had a family that was his anchor and his compass, a wife, Clara, whose smile was a quiet, powerful thing that could disarm him completely, melting the day's frustrations from his shoulders with a single glance. And there was Lily, their little girl, a whirlwind of energy and questions, who had her father's intensely curious eyes that missed nothing, and her mother's fiery, indomitable spirit that promised she would move mountains one day. Our dinners together were loud, joyful affairs, and I, the honorary uncle, was a permanent fixture at their table, basking in the warmth of a happiness that seemed as solid and permanent as the city itself. They were his entire world. And in one night, a world was enough for a bullet. It was a botched carjacking, the police said, a moment of brutal, random chance. Wrong place, wrong time, a statistic to be filed away in a cold metal cabinet. But for Daniel, it was the end of the universe, a supernova of everything good and bright in his life collapsing into a single silent point of infinite darkness. The investigation was swift, almost clinical. The killer, a low-level enforcer for a syndicate we now know as the Vipers, was scooped up within 48 hours. He was caught, he offered a flat, remorseless confession, and he was put away, the slam of the cell door echoing with a dreadful finality. But the conviction was a hollow victory, a wooden trophy given to a man who had lost both his legs. It didn't bring them back. It didn't fill the crushing silence in the home they had built together. a silence that seemed to scream louder than any noise. It didn't silence the phantom echo of Lily's laugh that would trick him from around a corner, or the gut punch of seeing Clara's favorite scarf still draped over a chair. That house, once a sanctuary of love and light, became a museum of his pain, each room an exhibit of a life he could no longer have, and he could no longer bear to live in it. He quit the force. The badge, he told me one night in a choked whisper that seemed to tear itself from a place deep within his ruined core, his voice raw with a pain I could scarcely comprehend, had failed to protect the only thing that ever truly mattered. The weight of it on his belt had been a promise, a covenant that by upholding the law he was safeguarding his own. That promise had been broken, and the polished shield had become a grotesque symbol of that failure, a lie he could no longer wear. I, his friend since college, the one who had been his best man and was meant to be Lily's godfather, did the only thing I could. I stayed. I planted myself on the other end of his crushing silences, a silent sentinel against the total darkness that threatened to consume him. I listened to the ragged breaths between his words, and when the words wouldn't come, I just listened to the silence. I made sure he ate, leaving simple meals on his counter, because the act of nourishing himself had become an afterthought to simply enduring. And when he decided, months later, to get his PI license, I was the one who brought over the forms, who helped him fill out the paperwork with a hand that was still unsteady, who co-signed the application for a bond he couldn't afford. It was a way to channel the skills he had, the brilliant, restless mind that couldn't stop working the angles of a case without the chain of command he now despised and the rules that had proven so futile. For it wasn't a calling, it was a life raft, and I was just helping him hold on. The decision to become a PI didn't come in a flash of inspiration, but as a slow, grim necessity, like a tide washing in over a barren shore. The empty days in his silent apartment were a different kind of prison. Each tick of the clock a hammer strike on his sanity. The law had failed him, but the hunt was still in his blood. He couldn't unlearn the way his mind pieced together puzzles, couldn't silence the instinct to seek answers. Being a PI was the only thing that made a twisted kind of sense. It was a way to use the tools of his old life, the suspicion, the deduction, the relentless pursuit of truth, but on his own terms, unfettered by procedure or politics. He could choose his cases, or so he thought. He could operate in the shadows where the bad things truly lived, without having to wear the badge that felt like a monument to his failure. It was a penance, a way to maybe someday balance the scales for one family since he couldn't for his own. It was the only door left open in a house where all the others had been sealed shut. The problem was, the phone never rang. Until today. The man who slid into our booth didn't look like a man who frequented greasy spoons. The fine wool of his overcoat whispered of tailors' fittings and boardrooms, a stark contrast to the cracked vinyl that sighed under his weight. His posture was rigid, the disciplined spine of a man accustomed to sitting in judgment, but it was a facade that ended at his neck. His eyes were shattered glass, reflecting a frantic, trapped energy that no amount of authority could contain. He moved with a jittery haste, his well-manicured hands fidgeting with a gold pen he kept drawing from his inside pocket and then stuffing back again, as if seeking a familiar anchor in a world that had suddenly capsized. He was Judge William Atticus, a name I recognized from the papers, his stern, uncompromising visage often photographed beneath headlines praising his relentless stance on organized crime. But the man in the newsprint was a statue. The man in our booth was that same statue moments after the earthquake, crumbling from the inside out. "Mr. Dillon?" he asked, his voice tight, strained as a piano wire about to snap. It was the voice of a man holding back a tidal wave of pure panic through sheer fraying willpower. Daniel just nodded, a single slow dip of his chin. He didn't offer a hand. He just watched, his own hands resting on the table, still and capable. He was a man who had already heard the worst news imaginable. He had no capacity for social niceties in the face of another man's impending doom. My daughter, Emily! The judge's composure cracked like thin ice, a web of fractures spreading through his dignified tone. She's 9. She was taken from her nanny outside her piano lesson yesterday afternoon. He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet diner. They sent a photo and a message. His hand trembled slightly as he slid a cheap prepaid burner phone across the Formica table. The screen was lit, displaying a digital horror. The picture showed a terrified little girl with red-rimmed eyes, her face pale and smudged with dirt. She was holding that day's newspaper, the date glaringly clear, a proof of life that felt like a threat. The message below was stark, the text brutal in its simplicity. Dismissal. Hernandez case, or you get her back in pieces. The words hung in the air between us, ugly and final, a sentence handed down not from a bench, but from the gutter. Miguel Hernandez. The name landed on the table between us like a live grenade. The charismatic leader of the Vipers, a man whose smile could charm investors on television while his organization flooded the streets with poison. He was currently on trial in Judge Atticus's courtroom, a landmark case built on months of meticulous, dangerous work. The same gang whose stray bullet, fired by a panicked low-level enforcer, had torn Daniel's life apart 2 years ago. The connection wasn't just professional. It was a grotesque twist of fate, a barbed wire tying Daniel's past to this man's present nightmare. I saw a muscle in Daniel's jaw twitch, a tiny, violent spasm beneath the skin. His stillness became something different, no longer passive but predatory, like a hound catching a scent on the wind. A storm gathered in his eyes, a dark, churning tempest of old rage and fresh, icy purpose that I hadn't seen since the raw days of the funeral. And this wasn't just a case anymore. It was a reckoning. It was a ghost from his own unbearable past, returned and wearing a little girl's face. And the man who had been adrift for 2 years suddenly had a shore to aim for. No matter how violent the waters in between. The police? Daniel asked, his voice low and gravelly, the words scraped from some deep, hollow place within him. It wasn't really a question. It was an assessment of the battlefield, a veteran knowing the first move of a conventional playbook. FBI is involved, Atticus said, the official acronym sounding brittle and useless as the desperation bled fully into his words, staining them with a father's terror. But they move slow. They negotiate. They have protocols, committees, and a flowchart for every possible outcome except for the one where my little girl is. He trailed off, unable to give voice to the threat. He leaned forward, his expensive suit jacket straining. The Hernandez dismissal hearing is in 48 hours. I won't risk their procedures with my daughter's life. I need someone who isn't bound by all that. Someone who can move in the shadows they create. His eyes locked onto Daniel's, pleading, imploring. I've heard about you, Dylan. I know what they took from you. The unspoken understanding hung between them, a shared language of loss. His final word was a soft, broken thing, a prayer offered to the only saint he thought might listen. Please. The unspoken words hung in the air, thick and heavy as the diner's grease-scented haze. You understand. It was not a question, but a stark, terrible fact. The judge wasn't just hiring an investigator. He was recruiting a fellow traveler on this road of anguish, a man who knew the exact dimensions of the hole now torn through his life. Daniel looked at the photo again, the glow of the burner phone screen, casting his face in a pallid light. He didn't see Emily Atticus for a long moment. His gaze turned inward, and I knew with a chilling certainty that he saw Lily. He saw the same terrified confusion, the same vulnerability stolen away by the same breed of monster. He saw the ghost of his own failure and his own unfinished story, a narrative of justice that had ended in a courtroom when it should have ended in a rescue. A profound shift occurred in the space of a single breath. The hollowed-out man receded, and in his place emerged something harder, sharper, a weapon being drawn from a long-forgotten sheath. He gave a single sharp nod, a gesture that was more a pact than an agreement. "We'll find her." And just like that, the mantle of a lost detective was shouldered once more. Daniel Dillon had his first case. My job as his assistant was to be the calm to his storm, the anchor to his ship threatening to run dark and run hard into the gale. While Daniel used his old contacts, a disgraced cop nursing a grudge here, a paranoid informant trading secrets for a few crumpled bills there, to lean on the edges of the Viper organization, applying pressure in the places that only a former insider knew were weak. I did what I do best. I followed the money. I retreated into the cool, logical sanctuary of numbers, a world where every transaction left a footprint, and chaos could be reverse-engineered into a ledger. The ransom wasn't about money. It was about leverage, a currency far more volatile and cruel. But leverage needs logistics. It requires a foundation in the real world. Someone had to rent the space, buy the supplies, pay the electricity to keep the lights on and the fear running. I buried myself in the digital catacombs of public records, cross-referencing corporate registries with lists of known associates, pulling utility reports for properties owned by a labyrinth of shell companies I had tentatively linked to Viper lieutenants. It was a meticulous, mind-numbing process, a digital needle in a haystack of deliberate obscurity, but it was a search pattern I understood. While Daniel hunted in the alleyways, I hunted in the spreadsheets, both of us closing in on the same prey from different worlds. Meanwhile, Daniel became a shadow, a fragment of the man I knew dissolving into the city's grim underbelly. He would vanish for hours, returning to our booth at Mel's with grim set lips, the scent of stale smoke and rain clinging to his coat, and his knuckles scraped raw from a recent, vehement disagreement with someone who had known something but required convincing. He was walking a razor's edge, the profound grief that had defined him for 2 years now forged in a furnace of fresh anger, fueling a terrifying, focused rage that made him both formidable and fragile. Every lead was personal, every closed door a personal insult. "They're not keeping her at the usual spots," he told me late on the first night, his voice a hoarse whisper as he slumped into the vinyl seat. The neon glow from the street painted his profile in streaks of red and blue, the city lights reflecting like distant fires in his tired eyes. He cradled a fresh coffee, his battered hands steady around the warm mug. Too obvious. The warehouses by the docks, the crack houses in the flats, the FBI will be kicking those doors down first. He took a slow sip, his gaze fixed on some middle distance only he could see. Hernandez's right-hand man, a snake named Silas, is running this. He's clever, pragmatic. He doesn't think like a thug. He thinks like a strategist. Daniel's eyes finally met mine, the intensity in them sharp enough to cut. He likes to hide in plain sight. Hide in plain sight. The phrase stuck with me, echoing in my mind as I sifted through columns of data. Hide in plain sight. It became my filter, my guiding principle. As I cross-referenced properties, I consciously ignored the obvious suspects, the abandoned warehouses, the remote hunting cabins, the derelict factories. Those were places for stories, not for strategies. Instead, I looked for the boring, the normal, the utterly forgettable places that generate no curiosity. And then I found it. A small self-storage facility on the industrial edge of the city, a place with a forgettable name and beige siding that practically blended into the gray sky. A specific unit, 42B, had been purchased for a full year, paid up front in cash, by a shell corporation whose labyrinthine ownership I had painstakingly traced back to a holding company I'd tentatively linked to Silas. The kicker? The utility bill for that particular unit, which owners are responsible for if they want power, showed minimal water usage as one would expect, but a massive, consistent spike in electricity consumption. It was a voracious constant draw, far beyond what a few boxes would need. Enough to power banks of lights, a space heater for comfort, and the sophisticated security systems of a man who knew how valuable his cargo was. It wasn't proof, but it was a thread. I showed Daniel the printout, the address circled in red. He looked at it, his eyes scanning the data, then back at me, and for the first time in 2 years, I saw a flicker of the old fire, the keen, analytical detective spark cutting through the fog of his grief. A slow, grim understanding dawned on his face. "A storage unit," he said, the words laced with a cold respect for the cunning of it. "Of course. No neighbors to hear anything. Privacy guaranteed." You roll the door down, and it's just a metal box. A perfect little prison. He folded the paper, his jaw set. The man was back. We didn't call the FBI. The judge had come to us for a reason, seeking a solution that operated outside their slow, methodical machinery. This was personal, a debt to be settled not by the system, but by the man the system had failed. We went in under the cover of a misty dawn, the world still asleep and swaddled in a damp, grey quiet. The industrial park was a ghost town, the only sound the drip of condensation from rusted eaves. Daniel's movements were silent, precise, a predator closing in, every step deliberate and sure. He approached the chain-link fence, and with a pair of heavy bolt cutters that appeared from his coat, he bypassed the cheap lock on the facility's side gate with terrifying ease, the muted snap of the metal seeming deafening in the stillness. We moved through the rows of identical roll-up doors, a maze of numbered units, until we stood before it. Unit 42B. The silence around it felt heavier, charged, holding its breath. We heard a faint, muffled cry from inside, a child's sob, choked and desperate. A sound that sliced through the cold morning air and twisted something deep in my gut. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated fear, and it made the theoretical horror of the case devastatingly real. Daniel's face went pale, the blood draining away as if he'd been physically struck. His hand, reaching for the padlock, trembled for a fraction of a second, a visceral, involuntary reaction to that specific, heartbreaking sound. Then, as if by sheer force of will, the tremor vanished, and his hand steadied into an iron resolve, his fingers closing around the cold steel of the cutters with a lethal certainty. In one fluid motion, he drew his gun from the holster under his jacket, the blue metal looking dark and serious in the dim light. He nodded to me, a sharp, silent command that held a universe of understanding. I, armed with nothing but a heavy tire iron I'd taken from my car, its weight suddenly feeling absurdly inadequate, took a deep, shuddering breath, my knuckles turning white around the cold metal. He didn't kick the door. There was no reckless, dramatic entrance. Instead, he used the bolt cutters on the thick padlock, the hardened steel jaws biting through with a sharp, definitive crack that echoed like a gunshot in the unnaturally quiet yard. The silence that followed was somehow louder. Then, with a powerful heave, he wrenched the rolling door up. It rattled violently on its tracks, shooting upward to reveal the darkness within. Inside, in a space furnished with a stained cot, a humming space heater, and a single bare bulb that cast long, dancing shadows, was Emily Atticus, small and fragile, tied to a wooden chair. Her head shot up as the door screeched open, her eyes wide with a terror that made my heart clench. A hulking guard, a mountain of a man with a coarse beard, startled from a nap on a folding chair, scrambled to his feet. His eyes, bleary with sleep, went wide with panic as he fumbled for a shotgun leaning against the wall behind him. He never got the chance. Daniel didn't shout. He didn't warn. There was no theatrical command to freeze. He just moved like lightning, a blur of focused motion. He crossed the small space in 2 strides, and his left hand, balled into a fist, drove forward in a single devastating piston blow to the man's throat. It wasn't a punch of anger. It was a statement of termination. A wet, choking gasp escaped the guard as his hands flew to his crushed windpipe, his eyes bulging in shock and agony before he crumpled to the concrete floor, dropping like a sack of stones. It was brutal, efficient, and born of a pain that had been festering for 2 years and now demanded violent, immediate expression. While the man writhed, gagging for air he couldn't draw, Daniel was already on him, efficiently securing his wrists with a zip tie from his pocket. He did it all with a chilling, mechanical calm. I rushed past him to Emily, my hands trembling as I worked at the rough ropes biting into her small wrists, using my bland accountant's voice, the one I used to explain tax law to soothe her, to tell her over and over that she was safe now, that the bad man was down, and that her daddy had sent us to bring her home. As I carried her out into the cool, fresh air, she clung to my neck, her small body shaking with great, heaving sobs that were equal parts terror and relief. The morning mist felt clean, washing away the stench of fear and confinement that had clung to her clothes. Daniel emerged a moment later, stepping from the gloom of the unit like a spectre leaving a tomb. His face was a mask of grim satisfaction and a profound, bottomless sorrow. He looked at the little girl in my arms, her face buried in my shoulder, and his eyes glistened with unshed tears that he would never allow to fall. In that moment, he wasn't seeing a client's child anymore. He was seeing a ghost laid to rest, a wrong made right, a variable in an equation of suffering that he had finally been able to solve. He was seeing justice, not the slow procedural justice of a courtroom that had given him only hollow vengeance, but a raw, immediate justice, delivered by his own hand. It was a different kind than the law could ever provide, and the weight of it settled on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a purpose rediscovered. We delivered Emily to her father on the steps of the courthouse, the grand marble columns standing as cold, impartial witnesses to a profoundly personal moment. The look on Judge Atticus's face, the sheer unadulterated relief that crumpled his stern features, was something I will remember for the rest of my life. It was the look of a man who had stared into an abyss and had, against all odds, been pulled back from the edge. He fell to his knees, his arms opening, and Emily broke from my side to sprint into his embrace, burying herself in the safety of his expensive suit. He held her as if he would never let go, his whole body shuddering with the force of his sobs. Then he looked up, his eyes finding Daniel. He rose, one arm still locked around his daughter, and grasped Daniel's hand with both of his, shaking it with a desperate, grateful intensity, tears streaming down his face, uttering fragmented thanks that seemed woefully inadequate for the priceless gift he'd been given. It was a transaction that could never be balanced on any ledger, a debt that could never be repaid, only acknowledged in that raw, silent moment of connection between 2 broken men, one now miraculously made whole. The Hernandez trial proceeded, its course now irrevocably altered. Without his leverage, without his key witness silenced, the Viper Kingpin's house of cards collapsed. The testimony flowed unimpeded, the evidence stood unchallenged, and the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts, a life sentence without parole. The system, for once, had worked as intended, but only because its rules had been broken elsewhere. Daniel didn't celebrate. He showed no reaction to the news when it flickered across the diner's small television. He just finished his pie, pushed the plate away, and walked back to our booth at Mel's, sliding into the worn vinyl with a quiet sigh. He caught Mel's eye and pointed to his empty mug, and a moment later, a fresh, steaming coffee was placed before him. He wrapped his hands around it, not drinking, just absorbing its warmth as he stared out at the passing traffic. "You did a good thing today, Daniel," I said quietly, breaking the long silence that had settled between us. It felt necessary to say it aloud, to mark the moment, to pull him back from whatever internal precipice he was staring over. He was quiet for so long, I thought he might not answer. Then his gaze shifted from the window to the dark liquid in his cup. "I got a little girl back to her father, Michael," he said, his voice low and stripped of any triumph. It was a simple, stark statement of fact. I couldn't, for me, but for him. His words trailed off, the sentence forever unfinished, the ghost of his own loss hanging in the space between the words. He had given Atticus the ending he himself had been denied, and the complex, painful math of that exchange was something he would be calculating for a long time. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The phone in our makeshift office rang again the next day, its shrill, insistent tone cutting through the low hum of the diner. It was a different kind of ring than the judge's call. This one was thinner, more desperate. The sound of someone with nowhere else to turn. Another case. Another soul adrift in this city's cruel currents. This time a woman's voice, frayed with exhaustion, whispering about a husband who'd vanished from his shift as a security guard at a high-tech research firm, leaving behind only a single, cryptic note and a security feed filled with unsettling shadows. Daniel Dillon looked at me from across the table, the receiver still pressed to his ear, listening to the faint, worried voice. And for the first time he didn't glance away in resentment or sink deeper into his grief. Instead, he gave a small, grim nod. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. The ghost was stepping back into the world, not as the man he was, but as the man he had become. The detective was gone, buried with his family. But the investigator had work to do. He had a purpose forged in loss, and a unique talent for finding those the world had swallowed whole. And I, Michael Knowled, would be right there in the booth beside him. My laptop open, a fresh cup of coffee at my elbow, ready to follow the money, to trace the digital ghosts, and to provide the calm to his ever-growing storm. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And make sure to subscribe so you'll be the first to know when the next story is uploaded.